All right. Thank you guys so much for being here today. We have the great Taylor Kilborn with us to present on navigating the wintertime blues. But before we get started, I just want to make sure that we are all familiar with some of the resources that we have here at Bronson. First, if you need any help finding a primary care provider or a specialist in a certain area, please visit the bronsonhealth.com Find a Doctor feature on our website or call the Care Advisors. They are also available to assist navigating finding a new provider in what specialty area you might be looking for. Secondly, if you are a Bronson patient, we do have the My Chart available, which essentially is just our electronic medical record where you can see your lab results, your x-ray results, all of that good stuff. Ask for a refill, message your provider. If you ever need any help with My Chart, our Bronson Health Answers is available at the phone number listed on the screen or by email. They're available to offer you any sort of technical support that you might need or navigating the My Chart. Thirdly, if you have any billing or payment questions, please reach out to Bronson Patient Accounting. They are there to assist you if you need a payment plan set up or have any questions about a bill that you may have received from Bronson. And then lastly, on My Chart, whether you're an active My Chart user or not, you can get a quote from the price estimator service or team if you call that number listed on the screen as well. So what that does is if you are referred, let's say for an x-ray, and you're like, oh, I just don't know how much this is going to cost me, you can reach out to the price estimator team or utilize that service on the My Chart, and they can give you a quote looking at your insurance coverage and the service that you have been referred for, give you a quote and to have an expectation of what your out-of-pocket expense is. So moving forward, again, thank you for being here today. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Taylor is a counselor with the Bronson HelpNet, and she is going to be speaking on navigating the wintertime blues. So I am going to pass the virtual torch on to Taylor now.
Good morning, everybody. So just a little note, I am fighting a little bit of a cough, so I'm going to try to mute when I catch a cough. But I do apologize for that in advance. I have a couple my nieces and nephews at home, and they're bringing the germs with them. So, so I'm Taylor. I am a limited licensed counselor at HelpNet. I am a clinical case manager and psychotherapist. So I do a lot of different things, but I typically handle crisis work and educating folks on different mental health related topics. So today we'll talk about navigating the winter blues. And what that means, what it looks like, and how to help some of those symptoms and things like that. So before we get started, I always love to do like a little breathing exercise. I'm just kind of giving us a moment to ground ourselves, kind of sit in the moment. So if you want to just kind of loosen your body, put your feet on the floor, drop your shoulders, take a long deep breath, and just kind of be present with me, ground yourself, and kind of just sit here and enjoy the presentation. Take all the information in and feel as relaxed as possible. So just some things that I'll be going over today. Some symptoms, what it looks like, what the difference is between maybe the wintertime blues and seasonal affective disorder as it's more technically called, the science and data behind those things, and easing and managing symptoms. So, stated here, the weather gets dark and gloomy, and sometimes so do we. I think especially this time of year, we can start to notice our energy decreasing, things like that. And so we want to, what does that look like? And what does it feel like? And how does it affect us moving forward? And why does it happen? So some just general symptoms, and this is an exhaustive list by any means, but these are some of the typical symptoms or um, things that you would notice for someone who is feeling the effects of the so-called wintertime blues. So things like sadness, loss of interest, that could be in the things you love, social relationships, work, different kinds of things like that. Lack of energy, sleep problems, which sometimes those two can go hand in hand. Obviously, if you're not getting enough sleep or you're feeling like you aren't getting restful sleep, then you're going to feel that lack of energy. But also, there's times when you do get enough sleep and it still feels like you're still fatigued, still feeling that lack of energy. Difficulty taking initiative. So, what that typically looks like is um, if you typically can get up in the morning and get ready for work with little to no issue, but that kind of changes maybe in the winter time. It's harder for you to kind of get up and go, as they say. So, what does the science say? So, typically, it has to do with the change in temperature or things like daylight savings. There's less sunshine and natural light. So, that typically results in low serotonin, high melatonin, low vitamin D, those kinds of things. Um, so, there isn't a for sure science behind this, and experts aren't entirely certain the direct link for the cause of the wintertime blues. But a lot of it, they believe, has to do with the seasonal changes, like I mentioned, and it disrupts the body's circadian rhythm. And so, like the 24-hour clock that regulates how we function during like our sleep and wake hours is affected because it gets, especially for us, like, for example, for Michigan, it gets darker earlier and stays darker longer, and so it throws off our body's natural like clock. It causes us to feel energized and alert sometimes and drowsy at other times. So that's affected and that comes and becomes imbalanced. And so they believe that that's the main reason why we can experience this. Our bodies aren't, for those who experience this, their bodies aren't adjusting maybe to that change as well. So a little bit more specifically with the wintertime blues. So typically the wintertime blues is considered maybe a less severe or less intense than the diagnosable disorder, seasonal affective disorder. But a lot of times they're synonymous. So for the sake of presentation and for language, we're just going to use seasonal affective disorder interchangeably with wintertime blues because they're typically linked together in that way. So I want to give a more specific definition of what the seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, is. It's a type of recurrent major depressive disorder in which episodes of depression occur during the same season each year. This condition is sometimes called the winter blues, as I stated, because the most common seasonal pattern for the depressive episodes to appear in the fall or winter and remit in the spring. So it is possible to experience this in the summertime. We don't see that as often. But for the sake of our presentation and the time of year, we're going to talk about it in the winter time. So it goes along with that seasonal gloominess, and it happens for that few months, and then we kind of see that change go back up into maybe a more positive experience in the spring. So just out of curiosity, in Michigan, it is estimated that what percentage of the population experience some degree of SAD? Does anyone know? Go ahead and put your answers in the chat.
All right, all right. We got 80% and 85% are the guesses for the estimation for the percentage of the population in Michigan that experience some degree of SAD. And somebody says, we do live in Michigan. Yes, we do. All right, guesses 80 and 85.
Okay, so I could see why that number would be guessed. It's we with the way that I explained and the way that we address it, it makes sense. And the actual scientific number is likely underestimated because it's going off of self-reporting and diagnoses and things like that. But it's actually 20 to 40%, which is still kind of a big gap. And that typically, again, is based on data that's reported or not reported. If it's seen as maybe not diagnosable specifically or things like that. So it is a little bit lower than we had thought, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it's good to know that there aren't as many folks experiencing this as we had maybe assumed. But it could be a little bit different based on report. That surprise anyone?
Surprises me, yes, and that's what the people in the chat are saying too. Yes, that is surprising. When we were preparing for this, I was like, I have a feeling people are going to guess 90% because that's what I'd say. You naturally feel it, right? That you feel the little bit more gloom during the winter time. So thanks for sharing.
So what is the prevalence? So if we're looking at the time of year, so typically January and February are those months that we actually see the highest rates, which to me was actually surprising. I thought it was going to be more November, December. But when we think about maybe the time of year, that January, February is when winter is really starting to hit the head usually. It's more gloomy than usual, and it's right around springtime. So there's lots of different reasons for that, I'm sure. But January and February are those highest rates compared to any other month. And then as far as like location, so Alaska, Maryland, and New York have some of the highest prevalence of winter seasonal affective disorder in the United States, which I found interesting, and it also made sense. Why do folks think that those are the three states maybe that have the highest prevalence? I'm curious.
So what do you guys think? Why do you think Alaska, Maryland, and New York have the highest prevalence of SAD in the US? Type it in the chat for us or unmute. We'd love to hear your voices. Somebody says overcast skies.
Well, in Alaska also, it's dark how many months out of the year?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how Maryland plays in with that, but I don't know if it's just because New York and Maryland because it gets dark so early there. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. And unfortunately, the science isn't for sure on that. There are so many different factors, and there could be even like cultural factors, accessibility to care. Those kinds of things can also play a role in that reporting. So that depends. That is dependent on the facts as well. Because I was definitely surprised by the Maryland one. I feel like that's not a state that we also hear about very often. So for me, Maryland was not even on my radar, to be honest with you. But it's interesting to know that there are other states out there who are experiencing this as well, maybe that we wouldn't necessarily think of when we think about this kind of thing. So I wanted to touch a little bit on like seasonal affective disorder, the winter blues, versus like major depression, which is that more intense diagnosable disorder that we often hear about. So seasonal affective disorder is, it gets given that name because it's usually for a season. So that's the biggest indicator. It's seasonal versus, all year round, which is, I mentioned that here. So the symptoms are very similar for each. The symptoms that we addressed earlier, loss of interest, sadness, fatigue, all of that stuff. But for seasonal affective disorder, like we would only really typically see that in the fall and winter season, or for a specific time of year. Whereas major depression typically is any time of year, and it's for longer periods of time. For things like weight gain, typically with SAD, you're more likely to gain weight. And Tina's going to go over a little bit about food habits later, but that is typically based on the diet that we typically have. I think especially if we look at like the holidays around this time, and we not really aren't going outside, those kinds of things, it makes sense that weight gain is more typical for SAD. Whereas like major depression, it could be gain or loss. Sleep effect. So you're more likely to sleep more for SAD. And again, that's probably more based on like light hours being limited, different things like that. But there could be a wide range of reasons. And then same with weight gain for major depression, it could be more or less sleep, depending on, what your body how your body reacts. And then light therapy. So this is something I'm going to touch on more specifically later, but this is one of the treatments that are developing for seasonal affective disorder. And there's been like a positive response to that for SAD versus major depression. It's more unclear if this is helpful or not necessarily helpful, but if it causes a positive reaction or changes and eases some of those symptoms. So I think this is good to know if that's something you're concerned about or wanting to address maybe with a primary care provider or a mental health provider, kind of using some of these things to kind of address maybe what you may believe is going on. So what can you do? What can help with seasonal affective disorder and easing some of those symptoms? So preparing, and what does that look like? That probably sounds super weird. How do you prepare for a depression, swing? So this can look like almost like pre-engaging in activities. So if you know this is something that will occur for you, or even if you're worried that it may occur for you, engaging in maybe like light exercise more often, or making plans for activities that will bring you joy ahead of time, making a plan for when you experience certain symptoms, or setting up appointments for your mental health provider. Those kinds of things come into play when you think about preparing for something like this. And honestly, you can never be fully prepared for a depression episode. Sometimes it just comes and we don't expect it to. We don't know when, and that's okay. And if you don't prepare, if you feel like you prepared but you don't feel prepared, that is okay. There's lots of other things. There's nothing wrong with that. It happens, and sometimes things that we think will work may not work. Unfortunately, there's not a one size fits all. So, just doing as much as you can and as much as you find helpful without causing yourself more harm. With that, finding what works for you. So what works for Susie, easing some of those mental health symptoms isn't going to work for Johnny, and that's okay. There's so many different factors. So what even works for Chelsea isn't going to work for Tina. Like, there's so many different things at play. There's, biological factors, there's mental health factors, there's environmental factors that come into play with what will work. So with that, talking to a professional, having them help you develop maybe a plan or other things that could work. Keeping a regular sleep schedule and monitoring your diet. So again, Tina's going to go over some more food-based stuff later, but keeping a regular sleep schedule, there's a lot of science behind going to bed and getting or waking up at the same time every day helps keep that that cycle going and helps you feel more rested. Utilizing your support system as much as you're comfortable. I know we often don't love reaching out to our friends or our family when we're feeling depressed or sad, or however you want to describe that. A lot of times we don't want to feel like a burden, or we just don't want to bother the folks around us with what's going on. But oftentimes they don't feel that that's the case. So utilizing your support system helps boost some of that serotonin and things like that is affected. It also gives us an outlet and a way to process what's going on. Sometimes just outwardly processing could be the best help. Light therapy, like I mentioned earlier, and self-care. I am a huge self-care guru. And so every time I get to talk about self-care, I will take the opportunity. So self-care can look like so many things. And I'm also going to touch on this a little bit more specifically as well. And all of this pretty much is self-care. And it's in the name, taking care of yourself. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So before we touch on the topic of using food as medicine, I would love to hear from the folks in the audience, like how does your diet change, during the colder months? Like, how does the food you eat change, or do you notice a change?
Mm-hmm. Yes, type that in the chat, or again, feel free to unmute and share with us. What changes do you see in the foods that you're eating during the colder months in comparison to our summer months? So we've got some answers so far. Definitely eating more comfort foods. I have to make more of an effort to eat a variety of fresh foods. And of course, we've got the holiday time treats involved, don't we? Yes, absolutely. And I think we can all probably agree with all three of those statements, right? We go to the grocery store right now, and it's just aisles and aisles of cookies and candies. Um, it's colder months, and so we're looking for those warm comfort foods that you talk of, right? Like for me, mac and cheese, right? That's all I want in the winter time. It's warm, it's comforting, it's cheesy. And so it just brings you a little a warmth during the cold months. So and then the making an effort to eat a variety of fresh foods, right? We don't have necessarily that farmer's market going on during the summertime, right? We're not going outside to our garden and picking our tomato or our lettuce. We have to, just like Taylor was saying, right? Plan ahead of time a little bit more for our self-care to prepare for some of these symptoms that we might feel during the winter time, but also plan a little bit more ahead of time so we can have a good balanced variety in our foods. Very good. Thank you guys for sharing so much. So I'm going to take over for just a minute as we talk then. Thank you, Taylor, so far about this great information. But we're just going to take a moment to talk about, just the concept of food as medicine. And I want to be very clear, right? Food is not going to treat seasonal affective disorder. Food is not going to treat major depression. But we know that potentially the types of foods that we include in our diet, and I don't use diet in any sort of derogatory way, right? Diet is not restriction when I speak on the word diet, but diet is just like what foods do we include on a regular basis? What foods are we eating at breakfast, lunch, and dinner? What foods are we eating at our snacks? That is our diet, what we are including. So when we talk from a mental health perspective, there is some information around the types of fats that we use in our diet. And of course, I know Taylor probably will speak on vitamin D status at a certain point and how that can impact potentially how we're feeling when it comes to SAD. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So what I wanted to present to you guys today was really the concept of the Mediterranean diet. We know the Mediterranean diet has been voted as like one of the best overall diets in general. Has it been voted specifically in the mental health realm? Maybe not, but it is a good solid base to use to promote health overall and can help us make sure that we are including all of those foods that maybe we miss out a little bit more so during the colder months. So that is what I want to present to you guys today is just this concept of the Mediterranean diet. There's lots of resources available around the Mediterranean diet. At the end of my discussion, I'm going to add a couple of those resources into the chat. Highly recommend looking at Old Ways, a website that speaks on like traditional style diets and provides a lot of good information on the Mediterranean diet. And there's also a woman who runs the Mediterranean Dish website. She also has social media pages, a very good resource for Mediterranean style recipes that you could take a look at during these winter months. So what is the Mediterranean diet? Again, the Mediterranean diet is not a diet, right? There's no restriction, but it's like what good healthy foods are we including most often? With the Mediterranean diet, if you've ever seen like the Mediterranean diet pyramid, the biggest section on that pyramid is fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, beans, seeds, and plentiful in olive oil. And so that is what we want to make most of our meals with fruits, vegetables, whole grains, speaking on things like, utilizing maybe a brown rice, a wild rice, a quinoa. Maybe we use some more of those ancient grains like bulgur or buckwheat. There's plenty to choose from at the grocery store there as well. Utilizing nuts and seeds for snack times, And then beans, and I'm not speaking on green beans here, but I'm speaking on legumes, right? Black beans, garbanzo beans, really making those plentiful in our diet. They're really good sources of plant-based protein, a really good source of antioxidants that help fight off disease and are very, very beneficial when it comes to a good fiber source, which keeps our heart health in check, keeps us satisfied fuller. So maybe we have less desire and cravings for some of those holiday time treats that we talked about or those comfort foods. Another big part of the Mediterranean diet is fish and seafood. Now, fish, specifically fatty fish, and when I refer to fatty fish, I'm speaking on fish that is very high in omega-3 fatty acids, which has been linked to a certain extent with overall mental health. And so we're talking fatty fish like sardines, we're talking salmon, we're talking tuna. Those are really good sources of fatty fish to include more often in our diet overall, but also in the concept of, these winter months as well. Overall recommendation to include fish and seafood into our diet is at least 2 to 3 servings per week. And so I'm speaking servings as about a 3-ounce piece of fish, right? So if we're having salmon, 3 ounces is about the size of most most of our palms of our hand would be about representative of a 3-ounce piece of fish. Now, I also want to mention that salmon, canned tuna can also be really good sources of vitamin D as well, which is a little shocking and surprising, I think, for most people. We think vitamin D, we think milk, right? And that is absolutely true, but let's not forget that our fatty fish, like salmon and tuna, can also be a really good source of vitamin D. And I want to share with you real quick, um, our recommendation for vitamin D is generally about 600, 800 international units per day. Now, of course, we're, in a deficit from a vitamin D lab status, then we, might need more than that, and you would have to talk to your provider about a potential supplement. But on a daily basis, most of us are needing 600 to 800 international units per day. So I just wanted to put that into perspective. If we were to eat a 3-ounce piece of salmon, that is about 4 to 500 international units of vitamin D in a 3-ounce piece of salmon. So our fish can be a good source of vitamin D because we know how challenging it can be to get the proper amount of vitamin D from food because there's so many limited choices, but also we just don't have good access to that sunlight during these winter months either. So the next step into the Mediterranean diet then is, moderate portions of, chicken and turkey, eggs, cheese, and yogurt. Moderate portions is how they are recommending those types of foods in the Mediterranean diet. We know that cheese and yogurt are good calcium sources. You can find yogurt and you can find milk, even plant-based milk that is fortified with vitamin D. So if you are using those items, please choose the items that specifically say fortified with vitamin D on the front. And then, of course, if we're talking about a pyramid, there's that very tippy top point of the pyramid, right? And that's where we put the meats and the sweets. We use those sparingly, less often in the Mediterranean style diet. And of course, water is the primary beverage of choice. When we look at utilizing comfort foods or sweets, that can be part of the self-care that Taylor was talking about. Like, how do we feel after we eat these foods? That might be something to kind of reflect on over the next coming months. Reflect on how we feel. Does it make us feel good? That can be something that can kind of motivate us to potentially spearhead some change in some of our food choices. So thank you guys so much for giving me the opportunity to discuss on the Mediterranean diet. I'm going to mute and allow Taylor to take over. We will have time for questions at the end, but I'm going to put my resources in the chat for you guys now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tina. So I wanted to include that just as Tina mentioned that there's, even though it's not necessarily a link to treating seasonal affective disorder or depression, that vitamin D piece is super important because it was mentioned earlier in the presentation that that is likely one of the leading factors to developing this this type of depression. And so, if we're not getting that in the sunlight, then getting it in our foods can help supplement that. And by no means do we want you to restrict yourself because sometimes food it can be medicine in the way of it's one of our comforts. And so we don't want you to take this and think it's the end all be all because it's not. And you have to do what feels comfortable to you. Um, And so, eating that extra cookie on a Thursday night after a hard day of work sometimes can be the best medicine because it brings us the most joy. And that is totally okay. So, we don't want this to be any kind of pressure on yourself, of course. But this was very helpful. So, thank you, Tina, for presenting that to us. So, then moving on to light therapy. I mentioned this earlier. So, this is one of the developing things that the research shown to be helpful for SAD. Um, so this little picture that's included on the slide is kind of an example of what a light box would look like. So it's supposed to, what's the word I'm looking for? Like almost, it, oh my gosh, I'm losing my words. Sorry. It's supposed to imitate natural sunlight. That's the word I was looking for. So it's supposed to imitate that natural sunlight. So if this is something you're interested in, talk to like your mental health provider or your primary care. Those are often the ways to discuss this. But it is still developing research. So it's not FDA approved yet, but there is a lot of positive growing research on that. So definitely do your own research on what you're comfortable with. I am by no means an expert in light therapy. I just wanted to put that out there, but it has shown great positive results because it does imitate that natural sunlight, developing vitamin D and serotonin, all of that fun stuff. So moving on to that self-care piece. Again, this is not an exhaustive list on what you can do for self-care. Self-care looks like so many things to so many people, and what works for folks. So one person may not work for another person, and that is totally okay. These are just examples of general things that I have found helpful for myself and for my clients. Things like practicing gratitude, that is always at the top of my list. And sometimes it can feel really silly to sit there and just think of things you're grateful for. And not in the way that we aren't grateful in general as people, but to be conscious about it and intentional about our gratitudes. So what I like to say is just to sit down, every morning or every night, whichever feels most comfortable to you, and just do 3 things that you're grateful for and make them different every single day. Because after those first few days, it gets a little harder to think of things we're grateful for. Again, not because we're not grateful, but because we think a lot of times we think of being grateful on the surface. So, oh, I'm grateful I have a home. I'm grateful I have a job. I'm grateful I have my spouse. Like those kinds of things are very basic, we'll call them. But when we think about I'm think about more internal. So I'm grateful for my ability to be empathetic. I'm grateful for my kindness towards people. So being that deeper level of intentionality with that gratitude, and it's going to take a minute for you to maybe feel that it's quote unquote working for you. It's a little bit of practice. Practice makes improvement kind of thing. So after a while, it'll become habitual and it'll having that positivity consciously come out kind of re-triggers that part in your brain. As humans, we naturally think a lot of the negatives or the quote unquote bad things that have happened to us in a day or in a week or in a year. So bringing out that gratitude and that positivity can help rewire some of that. Enjoying the sun when it comes. I know for Michigan, you never know. It could be a week, it could be every day. We don't know. So just enjoying it when you can, whether that's taking a walk or just stepping outside. whatever that looks like for you. I know I have a husky, so I have to be outside and take a walk whether I want to or not. So when that sunshine comes, it's very helpful. So like walking your dog, or if you have little kiddos, taking them to the park when it's warm enough, those kinds of things. Maintaining your social relationships, physical activity and exercise. And that doesn't have to look like going to the gym for 60 minutes a day. It could be just as simple as, adding a few extra steps in your day in the office. I know for me, I do a lot of sitting in my job. So I try to be intentional about, if I have to go talk to another clinician, like instead of calling them, I'll get up and go to their office if they're available. So adding that few extra steps, or taking the stairs instead of the elevator if you're physically able to do so. Using the bathroom at the end of the hall, except for the one, in the front of the office, or whatever that looks like. We don't want you to add pressure on yourselves to get in that 60 minutes a day every day for that's sometimes that's not realistic, and that's totally okay. Journaling has also been known to be really helpful, and this itself also looks different for different folks. So it could be, there's lots of different resources for journals. You could do it on your phone, on your laptop, you can do it on pen and paper. They also have like prompted journals, and you can buy those just about anywhere, Amazon, Target, Meijer. They also have like gratitude journals, so you can kind of link up that first and last point that I mentioned. So just kind of outwardly processing what's going on and how you feel and the things that you need to deal with can help us cope, I guess, is the best way to do that. Sometimes just talking about it out loud or thinking out loud is the best asset for us. So I wanted to ask you, how do you purposely spend time taking care of yourself? Maybe on, not even necessarily when you are depressed, but maybe on the days where you feel a little extra sad or things are a little bit more gloomy for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So go ahead and enter that into the chat. How do you purposely spend time taking care of yourself? So we've got answers such as going on a walk with my dog. Absolutely. They're a good catalyst for getting us outside and enjoying some of that sunshine. Working out every morning for at least 20 minutes. Yes. And thank you. That was a really good point Taylor made as well. Like, no pressure, right? You said practice makes improvement. And I really loved that. So thank you for saying that, right? Because whether it's 5 minutes of exercise or 10 minutes of exercise, and maybe it's not even calling it exercise, because that can be a word that people don't necessarily identify with, but just movement, right? Any sort of movement, just like you said, getting up and going to the other side of the hallway for a different bathroom. Anybody else? Moving the body, absolutely. Just move the body for at least the 20 minutes. Yes. And I'll add to the conversation. How do you purposely spend time taking care of yourself? Honestly, quiet time is good for me. Like, I love some quiet time. So that helps me just kind of get recentered, right? And rejuvenated. I am rejuvenated by quiet time. We appreciate you guys sharing so much. I also felt like you, Taylor, you had asked the question, or you said, 3 things that you're grateful for, right? To practice gratitude. I feel like that's a really good activity. And I would love, if we've got time, maybe even at the end, that maybe we could all kind of identify those 3 things and share with each other about what we're grateful for.
Yeah, I love that idea.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, thank you everyone for sharing. Like I said, it looks different for folks for every time of year, for every day, it looks different. I know it can change for me day to day, depending on how much time I have, what happened in the day, who I'm around, those kinds of things. Sometimes I want to be around my friends and family, and sometimes I want to be like Tina and just have that quiet time. I'm a naturally introverted person, so working with people all day, sometimes I don't want to go home and be with people, and that's okay. That's my version of self-care sometimes. So I love that. I love that you all shared with that. So I just want to leave you with the last couple little tidbits. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and I love sharing this in almost every time I'm with folks. When you feel least like you can afford to take a break is when you most need one. This is by Janet Barkley. And I love this because it's so true. Like, I feel like as a society, and especially if you're like in a helping role and you're at work all the time, and also if you have families, um, you feel like you can't afford a break. But those are the times when you usually need one. And I try to get folks to be more proactive than reactive. That's usually helps us get to that point of feeling overwhelmed. But sometimes that doesn't happen, and we have so much going on that it can be hard to find the time. So when you're getting to that point of, man, I really cannot afford to take a break today, that's typically when you would need one. And so trying to be intentional about what that looks like for you. Again, not to the point of causing yourself more harm. We don't want you to reach that point of you're stressing yourself out more by trying to not stress yourself out. Um, but we want you to try to be a little bit more intentional for taking care of you. Because taking care of yourself doesn't mean you first, it means you too. So this is another quote that I love because it's still very true. They say on the airplanes that you can't you shouldn't put someone else's oxygen mask on before you put it on yourself, because you can't help anyone if you aren't available to help them. So filling your cup is also important as helping fill another person's. So just keeping those things in mind as you process everything today and process what self-care looks like, and addressing your needs. Are there any questions about anything I addressed, myself, my role, HelpNet, anything? I'm open to questions.
And what I'm thinking is if we want to move forward and look at who people can contact if they want to reach out to a professional, then we can stop the recording, and then maybe we can ask some questions that way too. Oh, you're muted, Taylor.
Sorry. This is our phone number for the Bronson HelpNet outpatient counselors. So we have a provider in our Battle Creek and Kalamazoo locations right now. We're looking to expand that. But this is our phone number and our email. I can go ahead and throw mine in the chat as well. So that way, if you want to reach out to me directly, you're welcome to. I am available most days, and we'll try to turn that around pretty quickly. So if you want counseling with one of our outpatient therapists, give us a call. Or if you just have a question or a concern or anything like that, we'll try to help you as much as possible. You're also welcome to call this number and ask for me if you want to speak to me directly.
Great. Thank you so much, Taylor. I am going to stop the recording, and then we have a few minutes still, and so we can spend some time chatting if we want to and asking some questions. So give me just a moment.